a birds of a feather session. So this is like a panel, but open to, I believe, everyone in the channel. And it's going to be led by Phil and Mahimna, who just gave the last two talks. And the topic is going to be on MEV solutions. Phil and Mahimna, I think Mahimna just like bounced to go to the bathroom or something. Phil, are you around?
Hey, I'm back.
I'm here.
Mahimna's back. And Phil is also here. Wonderful. I guess gallery view would have helped with that. Great. So I think I'm just going to turn it over to you guys and let you guys organize this however you'd like. How's that sound?
Sounds great. Full disclosure, we didn't plan anything for this session, so it might be 5 minutes long. I actually do have a lot of questions, but I think I'd prefer if people from the audience join and start trolling us. So I'm just going to sit here in silence for like a minute, maybe to also say an intro, but other than that, I'm just going to sit here awkwardly, and like if it becomes too painful, then I'll start reading my questions.
So I guess I can jump in real quick. I'll kick us off. I actually tweeted about this on Twitter, but I thought your talk you gave on this is more to Phil about like MEV being fundamental and sort of never going away. I guess Mahimna disagrees because in his talk he even said that he doesn't necessarily agree with that statement. I had thought it was obvious now. Like I thought that anyone who's been paying attention at this point realizes that it's like fundamental to the architecture of basically any blockchain system, and like it's always going to exist. So I guess my question for the audience, for the whole group, is like, do we think that that's a controversial statement at this point?
So let me kind of just start by kind of putting forth my stance. So, I mean, I do somewhat agree that MEV is fundamental if you're talking about composition. MEV may, like my personal stance is MEV can be made to zero if you're looking at a system in isolation. But if you're talking about system composed with another system, then MEV may be fundamental. And almost likely it's fundamental. But I still don't think that like because it's fundamental that nothing can be done about it is like the right statement to say, because we still may be able to reduce it down to a small enough amount that the cost to extract that MEV is higher than the value of that MEV, if that makes sense. So as long as we're able to reach a world with that property, we should be good.
So I actually don't agree with that analysis. I think even with a single system in isolation, there's no way to reduce the MEV to zero. The reason for that is, to me, MEV is, it says nothing about like your system or assumptions or anything like that. It's other than the end state it reaches. That's the only thing you care about, is the beginning and the end state. And so it doesn't say anything about, for example, who's honest, who's following the protocol, anything like that. So any system where there's an incentive to manipulate it is going to have MEV, even if you kind of assume you have this ordering committee. That doesn't matter, because MEV is concerned with what happens when that protocol fails and actually doesn't deliver its guarantees. So in those cases, like you always have some possibility of a protocol failure. You know, that is always in some way MEV, as long as your system is important in the world, which is why, to me, like MEV is more an attribute of like the world and how your system interacts with it than it is of your specific consensus protocol. That kind of defines the game, but it's not what provides the source of the value. The value comes from just the economic activity on your system. So maybe we can argue that back and forth, but I think even for a single system in isolation, you can't reduce the MEV to zero unless you like assume something additional. That's point one. Point two, you know, just because I'm saying MEV is fundamental, I'm not saying we shouldn't test protocols, deploy changes to dApps, all this stuff. Like, I think what I am saying is, because it's fundamental, we need to do all of these things. We need to use fairness protocols. We need to change dApps. We need to educate users. We need to provide data. And we also need to democratize the extraction. Because I personally don't believe, and I guess this is the crux of our disagreement, I don't believe that it will ever be close enough to zero that it won't be worth extracting. Specifically, also when the system is kind of going through shocks or something extreme is going on, I think it's very hard to like take MEV out of that distribution if you have a system that's important to the world. So that's my rant. We can go from there, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think in your first point, you're kind of implicitly assuming some kind of composition. Um, and yeah, that's what I was gonna say.
I'm implicitly assuming like the final state has some value, which you can say is a composition. If you maybe, because like there needs to be some way to exchange that value if the system doesn't work. But I don't know. I don't personally see it as a composition because it's like not concerned with like the rules of any other system. But you know, I think fundamentally it doesn't really matter, like, because even so if your argument is that like even if you take out that final state value, then yes, you can have zero MEV because there's zero value. But that's like a world that's not possible to achieve, in my opinion. Also, a UPS truck is pulling out, so it's
If you
loud.
think about like MEV as just like the step before, right? If you think about it as just ordering manipulation, like what can you do to adversarially manipulate? Like how much can you adversarially manipulate the ordering? And if you stop at that stage, I'm calling that, let's say, like no composition. And at that stage, you can get to a point where there is like personal belief is there is no or very minimal MEV.
So I
Yeah,
see an interesting point in the comments, which is someone posting, is MEV the perfect segue for the state to go all in on regulation, KYC, FATF in order to quote unquote protect the citizens? And I think it brings up an interesting idea, which is like, what do we think about the analogs to MEV in the traditional financial world, right? Like I think that like when we think about like for example, a lot of the Wall Street bets drama in February and January of this year was around like these sort of like selling payment order flow. So I think like, what do we think about MEV? Like, can we maybe learn some lessons from traditional finance, um, like in our world, let's say?
I think there's a lot to say there. I think to answer the question directly, like yes, it is the perfect segue, and that is originally one of the actual like tracks MEV first took off on. So one of the first talks I gave on MEV was in 2018. It was at a summit at Wharton, which was a regulatory summit. The SEC was there. There were a lot of industry lawyers. There was like several government agencies. And the idea was to kind of talk about regulatory issues with cryptocurrency and explore that landscape. And I gave the Flashpoint 2.0 talk where I talked about MEV, I talked about the bots, I talked about kind of what was already going on the network. Yeah, I think it was very well received. And specifically, if you look into Angela Walsh, is her name on Twitter. I think she's a prof at U Chicago or a university somewhere in Chicago. She has done extensive work on asking the question and presenting basically the legal question of like, are miners fiduciaries for users? What obligations do miners have to the users of the blockchain platform? And is there are they in its traditional financial framework regulated actors? And one of the main arguments she's used to kind of bolster this case is MEV, that miners do have ultimately the ability to extract from users and to run protocols with like high degrees of freedom that affect the economics of the market. So yes, that's already happening. I can also say I know for a fact that the commissioner of the SEC has recommended Flashpoint 2.0 to several people who have then emailed me about it. So I'm sure these conversations are going on behind closed doors, and you know will be going on both behind open and closed doors in the future. I think the answer is yes, but that doesn't really depend on whether MEV is extracted or not. I think that depends on like a lot of kind of optics of the industry of like, how do we inform users? How do we build the dApps? How do we kind of run this infrastructure? And like, where do the profits go? I think these are all the questions that regulators would look at in this kind of thing.
So in that same context, I guess, if you have regulations, then even if there's MEV on the table, it still may just remain on the table, right? Because if you have like strong regulations coming in. So what are your
Yeah, so to me, this is an argument to like have a kind of very smart regulations around MEV that take into account this kind of geopolitical situation. And I think that is what is inevitably going to happen, because if you do want to be friendly to miners in your jurisdiction, having onerous regulation is going to make their operations in many cases unprofitable in the global market, because the bottom line is there are many regimes where this won't be regulated, and so do you want to incentivize miners to move there? I don't know. I think there's some in between where like kind of major attacks on the system, like long-term time bandit attacks, things that are clearly like kind of minor conspiracies against the users, could be regulated without regulating kind of interblock MEV, or sorry, intrablock, I guess, MEV, because I think regulating intrablock MEV too much does actually harm the system. And I guess then it's up to regulators of like how much do they want to require on miners in their jurisdiction, and like do they want mining at all, right? And like if they do, then they probably need some sort of sane framework to handle this rather than just banning it.
What is sort of your opinion on using like some kind of fair ordering protocol to reduce MEV up to the extent that it can, and then you enforcing regulation from like governmental agencies to get rid of the other MEV that's on the table?
I don't think regulation to remove MEV is a usable solution because of the argument I made that it subsidizes attacks. So like if the United States does that, then if China wants to get more power in Bitcoin or take control of a larger share of the network, it's like a direct subsidy for them to do that. Same with like Russia, same with any other geopolitical power. And like there's not just one power here, it's like a very complex power game. And to me, like basically if you say like by law you can't extract one block MEV, what you're saying is like mining any smart contract chain in our jurisdiction will not be competitive with other jurisdictions, which is fine. That's a policy. Maybe you don't want mining of smart contracts in your home jurisdiction, and then that's a sane policy. But if you do want it, then I don't think it's a sane policy. Yeah,
I'm just going to remind our panel moderators to look at the chat. That's all I want to say.
Yeah, I'm semi looking at it. Okay, so we have a few other questions here. Another one is from Sergey a little while ago. How important and dangerous is MEV for Bitcoin? Good question. Do you want to go first, Mahimna?
You can go.
Yeah, so hard to say, I think, at this point. Definitely Bitcoin has like less freedom in the system for validators to manipulate other people's transactions. Really the only thing they can do meaningfully in the MEV game is mostly like censorship and reordering. Insertions aren't as unbounded because like in Ethereum insertions, you can use any code, you can run any Turing complete script. There's a lot of power there. In Bitcoin, you really can't do much with an insertion. So there may still be some MEV from like making users pay more if the network is congested. Manipulating fees could be another example, manipulating fee estimators. Another example could be like very high frequency trading against centralized exchanges. So if the price is crashing and you want to move your coins to Coinbase as a miner first, you have that optionality, and then maybe you can make trades that otherwise wouldn't be profitable. But all of these are kind of much less direct opportunities than like in Ethereum, when you have the Turing complete extraction, you can just print money basically. So there's less of an incentive today. That doesn't mean it's zero. And like, I think it will eventually happen that we see attacks on Bitcoin. If Bitcoin is like $1 trillion system and actually matters, I think we will see MEV, but yeah, less. At the other point there is like, if you add smart contracts to Bitcoin, this changes completely. So like the proposals by like Square to add a DeFi layer into Bitcoin that sort of uses their servers for sequencing, or things like Rootstock, other chains that build on top of Bitcoin and use Bitcoin for ordering and security. All of these things then add MEV to Bitcoin, because by manipulating these layers, you can profit on the base layer, which is an incentive to manipulate the base layer. So if Bitcoin wants smart contracts, it will have to face MEV for sure.
The other thing I guess like I'd like to add is you can technically have MEV from the composition of Bitcoin and Ethereum. So you have like Bitcoin, like wrap Bitcoin on some Ethereum smart contract, and now anything that happens between the exchange rate of that Bitcoin versus some other token can be susceptible to MEV in like ordering manipulation.
Yeah, that's a great point. So like could be Bitcoin decentralized blockchain ARBs too, like Yeah. So if you control like moving Bitcoin into the gateway and there's like a massive price move, like, and people need to move liquidity into arbitrage things, you might be the only one who can do that, which might be quite a nice place to be. So yeah, I think there are kind of edge cases, but just because Bitcoin's script is so limited, that does take away a lot if you're just sending money. But that's the same thing on ETH, where like if people only ever used ETH to make payments and receive payments, then there wouldn't be as much MEV as there is today. Okay, let's see, we have more questions. Sarah, MEV extraction has created a thriving and lucrative industry, yes. What changes can and should be made to how that money is being distributed from the perspectives of fairness, stability, and lasting systems? What a great question. Any thoughts, Mahimna?
Yeah, I can go. I mean, I kind of try to draw parallels between like the MEV extraction game and sort of the selfish mining game sometimes. So selfish mining was something that it's like people found out, let's say like 9, 10 years ago, probably at this point. And basically, the more people try to selfish mine, the less profitable it is for everyone involved in the system. They kind of drag everyone else down. So we've kind of seen that selfish mining has become less and less popular, I guess, on blockchains. So I would kind of expect that similar things can be seen with like MEV extraction. Like the more people try to extract MEV, the more effort they have to take and the more resources they have to put in to kind of beat out their competition. So this may actually just become a problem that solves itself, in that like nobody wants to do MEV extraction anymore because it's a game that you have to put so much resources into to become profitable.
So yeah, I guess a few things to say about that, what Mahimna just said. One of them is like, there's also this question, it's very much a Twitter drama right now about reorgs. So like we are talking a lot about one block MEV. So like, what if when you mine, you kind of just extract as much as you can in your slot? I'd say that's like, if you make a taxonomy, that's like a less dishonest in the protocol terms form of MEV, because you're changing transaction ordering rules, which are kind of designed to be changed anyway. Miners do it all the time, but you're not changing consensus behavior. There's another level of MEV where you actually attack the consensus game. You combine it with things like selfish mining. And so one example would be like, if there's $1 trillion opportunity that comes along and I have 30% hash power, if Mahimna comes along and mines a block, it's now my incentive to like ignore his block and try to extract that MEV. Because if I have a 30% chance or even a 10% chance or even a 2% chance of that $1 trillion, that's worth way more to me than any protocol reward that I could get from following the protocol. And this actually happens in the real world. So like one example is Justin Sun, the CEO of Tron Blockchain, which is famously kind of a joke. He had $1 billion in Tron, like locked in some contract on Ethereum that was vulnerable to liquidation. So there was a period of time when any liquidator could have come and like poked his position and basically profited like 5% of $1 billion from doing that. You know, that's a huge bounty and is much, much bigger than the rewards plus the fees on ETH. And definitely, if everyone's doing this, the chain kind of comes to a halt, because like there's $1 trillion and everyone just keeps trying to build there. No one ever moves forward because no one will accept that like they didn't get that money, you know? And so that's kind of the nightmare scenario of MEV in Flash Boys 2.0. But I do agree with Mahimna that specifically in this kind of consensus attack MEV, this metagame comes into play a lot more. I think that's very much similar to selfish mining because it's kind of the same question of consensus attacks and involves the same techniques. And we do have a blog post as Flashbots basically talking about playing this game of reorgs and how like my personal belief is that by the same logic as selfish mining, if everyone plays this, it basically becomes less profitable for everyone than just following the protocol, honestly. Not just because we're all ignoring each other's work, but also because the price is going to crash and like users are going to get screwed over and et cetera. So I do think that's why we haven't seen this multi-block MEV. At the same time, the single block MEV doesn't really suffer from this. So the Flashbots client for single block MEV is purely additive. Like anyone who runs the client will make more money than not running the client. It's technically guaranteed in the code. Like there is no state in the code where you make less money than before. So in that case, it actually is profitable for everyone to run it. And we see now like 80% of Ethereum blocks have Flashbots bundles in them and pay the miner more than they would have without that. So I think in that case, the metagame is very different. And there we actually want everyone to do their best to extract, because they're still kind of satisfying the consensus meta properties and also increasing the robustness of that consensus game. Of course, that's controversial, right? Like some people don't want everyone to extract, but I do.
But yeah, I mean, then you're sort of extracting in the same kind of proportion as the resources that you're putting in. So it's like the rich get richer kind of scheme. Like whoever can dump more resources into the searching part can find the optimal or near optimal ordering for themselves first.
And I think
collusion with the miner, and maybe the miner like ignores some of the ordering for like some of the searchers or something, right? When you're directly competing with another person trying to search for the best ordering. So there's like a lot of intricate games that are simultaneously being played.
That's very true. The question is just like the most.
We don't really understand them fully yet.
I think that's very true. I think there's a question of what is the most profitable game to play. So like, yes, you might have miners that make these out-of-band agreements, like I will listen to you, searcher, and ignore this other one. But basically, anytime they modify the Flashbot software and have such a side agreement, they will be making less money. That's like technically guaranteed, right? Because like in the case where the searcher they have to deal with was the more profitable one, they would have just mined them via Flashbots. In the case where that searcher is not the most profitable one, then they actually want to take the other one because they'll make more money. So the side deal like would be detrimental to the miner in the one block case. There may still be a metagame incentive to like foster this relationship with the searcher and like have like eventually kind of outcompete other people. That's a very different game. But strictly for the one block case, like it is always most profitable to run the client. And I think to me, this isn't exactly the rich getting richer. It's like a lot more complicated than that. Several reasons. Number one, like searchers and miners are actually different parties. So most searchers, like anecdotally, like just from Twitter and stuff like that, they're not generally like rich people because you need to put in a lot of work to even get started. That doesn't really pay you. And you probably could make more money doing things like mining or other kind of capital intensive rather than knowledge intensive activities that are also less competitive because they are capital intensive rather than knowledge intensive. So, it's not the case that searchers and miners are necessarily the same parties. We have a lot of searchers that are just like random people. And for miners, we actually want the split of MEV to be proportional to your hash power. Right. So like if you have 80% of the power, we want you to get about 80% of the MEV. Why? Because in no world are you going to get less than 80% of the MEV. There's like definitely a clear intuitive impossibility result there. Right. And we don't want you to get more than 80% either, because then that'll be a centralizing force. So if you have 80%, we want you to get 80%. And that's kind of the best single block game, in my opinion.
So, I mean, one thing to point out is like for the searchers, right now we're seeing like the initial stages of this game, right, where everyone's like trying their hand at different strategies of what type of like their searcher tools of what works for the best ordering for them. Eventually, like I can predict that, we might evolve into a game where even the searching part is standardized and you just run like this search tool that just finds like perfect strategies for you, and then it again becomes like a put money into a game rather than a knowledge-based game. So we're really seeing like the initial stages of this game, and we're not really sure how it's going to evolve.
Well, you're not a game theorist, Mahimna. I have so much to say about that. Okay, yes, yes, we're seeing the initial stages of this game. I agree. However, I don't at all agree that it'll play out the way you say. So the goal of the game is actually to make most forms of MEV commoditized, and the goal of this game is to have most kinds of MEV basically send all the profit to the miner. So in those basically boring MEV cases, we want this kind of standardized tool that like is boring, right? And like the miners aren't incentivized to run it because it barely makes any money. Someone's running it and sending all the money to the miners anyway. Basically, in the Flashbots auction, because of the way it's kind of a blind auction, sealed bid auction, if there are two people who go for the same opportunity, me and you, in the world, basically that opportunity is no longer going to be profitable unless we collude. That's the bottom line. So that has like several interesting consequences. Number one is in the long term, for any kind of opportunity that can easily be standardized and you can have like an open source style bot for, that's going to go straight to the miner, right? Because the miner is just going to run that and send it to themselves. And if they don't, then two non-colluding parties are going to run it. And then their incentive is to bid like 100% minus epsilon in the auction. So either case, as MEV becomes commoditized, it goes to the miner. And that's actually what we want, right? Because if it doesn't all go to the miner once it's commoditized, then the miner is incentivized to do it themselves, and we don't want that. So that is the goal of this game, is to send all the money to the miner as efficiently as possible. That being said, it is a knowledge-based game, and the state space is infinite. And like finding these opportunities, especially on the cutting edge, keeping up with new protocols, it's non-trivial, something that's like very hard and requires a ton of engineering. And so for those kind of initial opportunities where you've put in a lot of effort and you've done something that's not obvious, then we want more of the profit to go to the searcher. Why? Because that'll incentivize basically this robust community of people who's pushing that edge and pushing that alpha. And that latest alpha, that latest like 2 weeks, 1 week of alpha, that's where all the profit is, right? The rest is all commoditized. Like that's fine. That's what we want. That's how you build the system to be robust. But this kind of 2 week alpha or whatever is like an important way to actually make sure people show up and play the system. So that's my shoot back on the dynamics of the actual game. Happy to hear a response.
I wanna poke you guys again to look at the chat. I think there's a particularly good question from Ward, which is he says, Phil, why do you say it's impossible for someone with 80% hash power to get less than 80% of MEV?
If everyone is trying to get the max MEV, let's say like they're playing the MEV extraction part like approximately similarly, right? Then why would they get less than 80%? I don't see a possible scenario where they do.
I mean, you could imagine like 80% of the hash network just perfectly acting like totally honestly, and now they're mining like most of the blocks. So really, and they're just keeping the MEV on the table. And if you ignore like the long range reorgs, then basically they don't make 80% of the MEV.
Okay, let me rephrase. In any stable equilibrium, 80% extracts at least 80%.
But technically, this is a stable equilibrium, because it's over 80, like it's 80% hash power, right? If it's like over 50%, it's like stable.
I mean, not if you look at like rational incentives, right? It's like stable if you assume honesty. So like without assuming anyone's going to be honest.
Stable in the sense that, yeah, like everyone else can act however they want. This 80% will act this way, like stable in that sense.
Right. And if you have that system, then you don't need a blockchain. You just need a BFT protocol, and you can run MPC based ordering and, you know, doing threshold encryption, and then you don't have any problems whatsoever. But, you know, having an 80% honest quorum that we trust, and that, you know, we give the ability to rob us and trust that they don't do it, is like, I don't think that's realistic.
I agree. I was just like making the point.
Yeah, so I do agree, I guess, with the point that like in practice, yes, 80% might not extract 80%. Like that happened on the Ethereum network. Like it was the smaller pools that first started extracting MEV. And so the bigger players were more conservative because they have more at stake, more to lose. And so that was actually the case for a while, but long term, you know, if there's a fight on, then I don't think you're going to be in a case where like 80% gets less than 80%. Yeah. Maybe my claim was too strong.
I'm gonna poke you guys to talk about Fan's question about SGX. And if
yeah, can you do the poking, Tyler? Because there's a lot of messages coming in, and I'm
okay. Do you want me to just manage poking? Is that what you're?
Yeah. That's what I'm saying.
Oh, great. So Fan asks, how essential is something like SGX to efficient MEV extraction?
Mahimna, what do you think? I think your answer is not at all, right?
I mean, I have you know, different like statements to opinions, I guess, to say about SGX. But yeah. I mean, I don't know if like we want to live in a world where like everyone in Ethereum is like running SGX extraction rather than like normal extraction. But yeah, I'll leave it at that.
What do you guys think the difference between SGX and normal extraction is going to look like in practice? Maybe you can expound a little further what you mean there?
So at the end of the day, in my opinion, like extraction is always, if you have this API boundary between miners and searchers, then extraction is always going to be something that requires some degree of trust on the part of the miners to not basically screw over the searchers. God, these birds need to shut up. And so, you know, if you're building this API boundary of like, we want this game of both searchers and miners, then you really have two choices. Either the searchers need to somehow trust the miners. I guess three choices. Or you use SGX to kind of eliminate that, and instead you trust Intel. Or you use cryptography and you trust that. So I think all those approaches have different trade-offs. In my opinion, the worst one to be in is the one where there's ad hoc trust relationships, where searchers just have relationships with miners that they trust not to front run them. I think that world is like really, really bad for many reasons. Number one, it's like super inefficient for the searchers. You constantly have to be worrying about like which miners are acting honestly, which ones are screwing you, and which ones are like doing what you say. And you also have to do biz dev on like the miner side, which is like super onerous, and you have to have contacts there and etc. So I think that game of like ad hoc trust base kind of collapses into like a game where miners have a lot of power, and there's not a lot of like clear network stability or benefit. So to me, that's like the worst case MEV game, and like that's where the network was headed kind of without a programmatic game, and that's where it will head if we stop. If Flashbots and like all other MEV companies in the space, in my opinion, disappear today and stop doing anything, that is where MEV is going to go, and that's where it was always going to go. I think having SGX kind of allows you to at least shift that to a third party that's like a little bit less incentivized to mess with the system. And I think there are ways to do it in which it's not in like the core main ETH kind of pipe, and like will not affect the system completely if it breaks or anything like that. And I think that will actually happen in practice because like the trade-offs are the most realistic. Cryptography is also a great idea, right? Like if we had a magic box to like do MEV extraction through cryptography, that would be great. But it seems like a lot of the primitives you need to hide information, like zero knowledge proofs, MPC, those kinds of abstractions, either come with like trade-offs that make it unusable for ARB, like you need to know the state in advance, or just have too high latency because you need to do these things in real time for them to be useful. So I think SGX gives us a way to get like the magic crypto abstraction and break this minor game that's like really degenerate that would happen otherwise. And so I do think it's important in the landscape, but this is very controversial, and like a lot of people don't want it. A lot of people want to build purely economic systems, etc.
Yeah, I mean, I would like to say, like, you know, if you put something like SGX trust into the system, then, like, if you're okay with SGX trust into the system, then maybe you might not even need MEV auctions if you just have the consensus itself built on SGX, and it's something that you trust wholeheartedly, then maybe that's, like, the better way to go, because now you can prevent the miners from doing any kind of manipulation they want up to whatever level you trust the SGX. So, yeah, that's sort of...
Yeah, I mean, I think there's different levels to which you trust SGX. Like, I think it would be totally inappropriate to trust SGX for consensus personally, but I think trusting SGX to prevent things like bundle flow in searchers who are looking for MEV being spied on by miners is different, because then worst case, if the miners spy on the bundle flow, they break SGX, that's what they get to do, then the miners will make more money at the expense of the searchers. But these are both kind of professional actors who are taking some risk and like kind of engaging in this. All other system users are like totally unaffected, which I think is a very, very important property. And also the blockchain keeps working. So to me, it really depends on the specifics of your SGX solution. Like what happens when it breaks? Can people tell that it broke? And yeah, really, what are the consequences of it breaking? So yeah, I don't know. It's hard to say. I think for MEV, the consequences can be made low, but that's an open question also.
So I'm gonna quickly abuse my position as the poker and throw a tomato at you, Phil, which is that you say that the worst case is this sort of ad hoc thing, but right now Flashbots is ad hoc, trusting miners not to screw the searchers. So the worst case is the case right now. But I don't want to actually you to respond to that because I don't want us to get tangentially off track. Leland has a good question, which is are auction prices evenly distributed over a long time period? So like that long tail and auction prices, like when we look at this like set of auction prices, like are they relatively even all the time, or is there a lot of variance in the MEV like extractable in what you guys have seen in your studies?
Yeah, there is a lot of variance, definitely. That's something that we pointed out in Flash Boys 2.0, and I think distribution broadly hasn't changed. Like there are several MEV opportunities that are absolutely massive, and they dwarf normal blocks. And most blocks do have some MEV, and like it is substantial compared to fees, but it's completely insignificant compared to the high MEV periods. So that's also what we see in Flashbots auctions. Like obviously, if there's a high MEV period, the miners make way more revenue. Also calls into kind of question, Sarah's question of like, how can we design the economics of MEV extraction to also be better for everyone, right? So like, I think perhaps there is a valid case to be made for smoothing rewards among validators to reduce this variance. I think miners would actually prefer to have like more of the rewards or like same expected reward with less variance than kind of be taking this variance. And I think if you do something like that, you can also anchor in incentives to extend other people's chains and stabilize the system. So I think those are all important long-term features that will kind of dampen a little bit these periods of high MEV because they'll be shared by everyone in the system rather than just the people who mine those blocks.
I think one additional point is like sort of if you have this like exponentially decreasing function of MEV, then it also does incentivize like reorgs, because if there's only a few blocks that contain like massive amounts of MEV, then it incentivizes miners to kind of fork the system and try to mine that block themselves. So there is like a lot of interesting game theoretic things at play there.
Yeah, absolutely. It might actually be better if like in high MEV time periods, every block had a high MEV for a long time. So you'd have to like reorg the whole time period to make money rather than just like one block. So yeah, that is a great point. The distribution is absolutely terrible for security, which is kind of the claim in the original Flash Boys 2.0 paper, but it hasn't gotten any better since then.
Cool. So I have a question from someone named Skyhard. If I compare different L2, I assume the situation is even worse with rollups, Optimism and ZK, or Optimistic, excuse me, and ZK. But I have never heard about MEV on Lightning. What is your take on this? What's your take on sort of these L2 solutions and MEV and how that interplay happens?
If you want to start this one off.
Sure. I mean, MEV on Lightning, I guess, if you just think of Lightning Network as just like a payment channel, then there's not so much, I guess, MEV to talk about on that. MEV can really come if you're talking about like some kind of DeFi contract where ordering is really important. It can affect like validity of transaction orderings on Lightning Network, which may be able to be composed with something else for profits to be made. But I guess in general, the MEV there would be like quite small. When comparing to like, I guess, different L2 protocols, one thing that I've been thinking about recently is if you just had like fair ordering protocols on L2 and some like standard protocol like just normal Ethereum on L1, then does that actually give you like fairness if you can use the L1 to front run the fair ordered L2? So it is an open question if like what the constraints are that make L2 fair ordering good enough when the L1 system is unfair to begin with.
Yeah, I think it's a really fascinating open question. I will say, like one caveat, I think Mahimna's thing about Lightning is totally true. Especially if you look at one block MEV, there is, as Patty mentioned, the challenge period. So in some ways, all layer 2 periods have like this longer period of like their assumed censorship resistance assumption on the base layer. If you break that assumption, then you can steal basically everything in almost any L2. So the way L2s work is they actually, in many cases, decrease kind of one block MEV because they're taking that off the chain, or maybe if they don't decrease it, they move it somewhere else. But they also increase like many block MEV, which is probably less relevant, probably less likely to be attacked, especially in a proof of stake, but is an important point that there is some bounty to like censor the entire reveal if you're not careful about it. And I think that's in general what dApp devs should do, is kind of like make sure their censorship resistance assumption is realistic, and also use that to reduce, to take as much short-term MEV into like long-term MEV as they can. That's kind of I think, the general formula for preventing extraction.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, in general, like there's sort of this trade-off between like UX or efficiency and security, right? Because you can technically have this like fraud-proof period for a really long time, and that kind of the trade-off there is on the user experience and getting their money. But now you make the attacks like much more strong. Like the need like to attack the system, you need to have like way more resources because now you need to reorg for like a longer period of time, or you need to censor transactions for substantially like hundreds of blocks or something like that. So there definitely is like this trade-off.
Yeah, and I think, at least in my estimation, a similar trade-off exists in like fairness protocols or batched exchanges and like latency. I don't know if anyone's proven this. Maybe in traditional finance, I'm just not aware, and someone has. As far as I knew, last time I looked, no one really proved it.
Tried like quite a bit to formalize something like that a while ago, and it's not so trivial. Like I do intuitively think that there is some kind of fairness efficiency trade-off that we can prove, like some kind of general result, but it is somewhat tricky to like put into formalism.
I also tried like 3 years ago and didn't succeed, but I think I also intuitively very strongly believe it exists, and I've never seen it not exist anywhere. And so I guess that's an open challenge to any PhD students on this call that are smarter than me. I won't say smarter than Mahimna, because that's not my right, but who can prove the things that we couldn't prove, because I think that would be a really interesting result. And then you could probably use that as like a black box to like say things about ARBs across like kind of low latency, high latency exchanges that I think would be a great piece of work. So yeah, if anyone's interested in that, reach out.
Yeah, definitely. Like one thing that might be a cool kind of result if the asymptotic efficiency is unchanged, but some like maybe like some practical efficiency suffers some loss. But if the asymptotic efficiency is unchanged, then that could be like a very strong result. So that basically proves that using like a stronger definition of fairness doesn't really provide a lot of drawbacks.
Yeah, I think that would be really fun. So open research challenge for anyone in the audience.
Yeah, come collaborate with us.
Okay, do we have more questions, or should I go to my, oh, here we go. Perfect. Thoughts on leaderless protocols and MEV, or the staking equivalent, especially ones that take advantage of random sampling of the validator nodes like Avalanche. Okay, this is like, yeah, maybe I'll let Mahimna also rant about it, but Goon and I had a lot of fights about this in Avalanche like a year or two ago of, is there MEV in Avalanche? And I think at the time there was a narrative, I won't say who forwarded it, but there was a narrative in the space of like, if your protocol is leaderless, then it doesn't have MEV because like there's not the leader that can extract it. My response in 2018 was, no, that just makes the game probabilistic because you're, still incentivized to like be biased to prefer a certain transaction to another. And yeah, anything you want to say about that, Mahimna, I guess, before I...
Yeah, sure. Like one point I'd like quickly make is, yeah, we realized in our work is two statements, right? So permissionless protocols are not inherently MEV free. So MEV can still exist on permissionless protocols. And permission, like leader-based sort of protocols, are not necessarily like full of MEV either. So like leader-based protocols can still be somewhat fair, and leaderless protocols are not necessarily fair. Like there can be unfair leaderless protocols, and there can be fair leader-based protocols.
Yeah, so I think it really comes down to like the specifics of the protocol. And I had a talk in Ari's group where I kind of talked about how I see it, which is like, you look at the code that you're supposed to run as the validator for the protocol, and you ask yourself, like, what are all the things I could do on this network that like aren't in this code or that are outside of this box? And you can kind of itemize like the space of behaviors that like other people will react to, and then see what the consequences of that are. So like, what are the consequences of just delaying delaying this one set of transactions by like 1 second every time? That would be one example of like all the freedom you have. So when you look at a leaderless protocol, you still have a lot of freedom of like, which transaction did you hear first? Which transaction do you prefer if there are conflicts? None of these questions are really solved by leaderless protocols. And I will say that MEV on Ava not only exists, but is an active community. Yeah, I think even the Ava team at this point has messaged me being like, you were right about us having MEV. So yeah, I think there's a new understanding of like what actually causes MEV and which protocols it's in.
I have a question which I didn't post in the chat, but I wanted to talk more about multi-block MEV because I feel like it's an understudied topic in the space. Can you talk a little bit about the different kinds of multi-block MEV that exist that you've seen and what you think about multi-block MEV?
Yeah, maybe I'll just talk about a few. So one of them is kind of the original nightmare scenario general attack that we described in Flash Boys 2.0, which is a time bandit attack, which is basically that like, let's say instead of taking one block of MEV, I managed to reorganize an entire day. Then I have all the trades that users made on Uniswap all day that I can reorder however I want to, with perfect knowledge of like how the rest of the markets are going to evolve throughout that entire day. So this large set of trades to reorder across that whole day gives me a lot more optionality on like how bad I can manipulate people than just having this like small set of trades over one block and this very constrained kind of game. So that's what we call a time bandit attack. It's basically like if you could time travel to the past and like have all the share prices and like know everything you know in the future, you could like rob banks, you could like do whatever, bring old technology, like that's kind of all possible in this world. You can do attacks that people didn't even know about at the time. So that's one form of multi-block MEV. Another one is censorship of L2s. So like we said, like screwing with L2 challenge periods. Another one is like systems that use liquidations. Oftentimes have multi-block kind of auctions or periods that can be manipulated on a multi-block scale, but not a single block scale. And I think the last one, which is more interesting and more different, is what they call Uncle Bandit attacks. So this is specifically one block or two block, I guess, reorg, two block MEV. And what you do is you basically look at other transactions that people have made extracting MEV, and you specifically reorg those. So not only do you extract the MEV, but the people who extracted the MEV lose money because they're like taking risk that you're like screwing them over on. And this is something we see on the network. Whenever there's an orphan block, you know, something happens, you get two blocks at the same height, you see people who are searching for MEV basically get exploited by whoever's doing the reorg. And there's an open question still on ETH of, is this happening intentionally? Are people doing this on purpose today? Or is it like an honest orphan that just happens to maximize its MEV? Has the kind of frequency increased with more MEV is one way to ask this question. So yeah, open questions, but there's a lot of different things you can do there.
Has the uncle rate gone up since flashbots became more prevalent?
We don't know. So that's something we're looking at right now. Literally, as we speak, there's a team kind of putting that data together and thinking about like looking at profitability for various people in the Flashbots ecosystems across uncles and doing that kind of stuff because, you know, obviously this is important for the community and like it changes the risk profile of extracting MEV. So it is a big deal and definitely something that's ongoing.
Okay, so there's a question in the chat. I don't actually understand the question because I don't know the jargon, but maybe you guys will. Macaulay introduced the notion of player replaceability applied to leaderlessness. Can this help?
Mahimna, this is a you question.
I'm not actually familiar with the particular thing that you're describing. Can you maybe describe it in a little more detail?
So maybe Mr. Skyhard, can you elaborate further?
I'm pulling up the paper. Oh, my answer is not in the abstract. Oh, hard times. My guess is like no, but that's just yeah, I would have to read the paper. I can't find a PDF. Oh, here we go.
One thing, like we did have like this notion of player replaceability in our permissionless fair ordering protocol, where we basically like use proof of work mining to transform it into a permission setting, where we consider these like permission setting to be like virtual parties. But you still need some kind of fair protocol in this virtual permission setting for it to help. Like I don't think just transforming, assuming player replaceability here also means just transforming the permissionless setting to a permission setting. Only that does not help, I would say.
Another question in the chat. What happens in the MEV world when a searcher and a miner are controlled by the same party? Does that hurt competition between searchers?
What a great question. That is actually, in my opinion, like a desirable thing to have happen. Like my desired state of the game, and this is very controversial and not like a scientific fact, right? Like it's open to debate. But I want miners who are running MEV extraction to have more profit doing it as a searcher on Flashbots than doing it in-house. Why do I want that? Because if that's the case, if that's the game, then it incentivizes them to basically share that knowledge with the network and also democratize the profits of that extraction. And I think that might be the case, right? Like, let's say you're sandwiching people on Uniswap. If you have your own bot, you can do it in 10% of blocks. Let's say you have 10% hash power. And you'll get 10% of basically the sandwiching revenue for Uniswap. Sorry, someone's outside, kind of sketchily cruising me. Right, so you'll get about 10% of the profits. Now, if you run a bot on Flashbots, right, you'll not only get the profits of like that bot kind of acting on your hash power, but you'll also get the profits of that bot acting on everyone else's hash power. So in that initial period where you're the only bot, you're going to get more than 10% of the profit because you're profiting from kind of everyone. In that, once the equilibrium comes and all the profit from that game goes to the miner, then it'll be the same as you running your own searcher, right? You'll get 10%. So the goal is to create a game such that it's always more profitable to play the game and democratize your profits than to be selfish. I think open question whether that's possible, right? There's some certain advantages like latency, which are hard to democratize in this way. And that's like an active research area. But I think by making those advantages small and making the game really easy to join and hard to deviate from is kind of the best shot at creating that equilibrium.
So we got some clarification from Mr. Skyhard here. So he says that a round of BFT consists of a few protocol steps. If you switch the voters within the round, arrow, more randomness, MEV extractor cannot simulate his outcome.
Yeah, so as far as I can tell for player replaceability, it doesn't much affect MEV. Definitely one block MEV is not affected, right? Because if you're in this subset of players, you're still incentivized to prefer whichever transactions pay you to prefer them, whether or not you end up contributing to the consensus or not. If you can provably do this, it's still like the incentive is still there to do it. In terms of multi-block MEV, this kind of rotation does imply some sort of subjective notion of what is kind of finalized and accurate, right? Because like if all the old players can be corrupted, the idea is that like the client never switches back, and in that case, it's the same as having basically subjective finality in like any network, like just not accepting. Like let's say you modified Bitcoin to just ignore reorgs past depth 2. That would basically be what this change does. Yeah, and that does change the game, but it also opens you up to things like partitions and other failures as well.
Leland asks, why can't bundler submitter, like searchers and bundle submitters, specify like minor controlled variables such as block.timestamp? This is a very Flashbots oriented question, so I guess Phil.
No reason for it now, I guess. There's not, they can sort of implicitly do it, right, by like having a transaction that only produces MEV in certain time-stamped regimes. But the reason is like it just hasn't been developed yet, and also it adds complexity at like every layer of the stack. So like Flashbots has a bundle merging thing, right, where like each block contains more than one bundle, and this would add kind of conflicts there and constraints. So as far as I know, there's no kind of deep, fundamental reason for this. It's just it hasn't been developed yet.
We have 5 minutes left in this session. I just want to let everyone know. But we seem to have a pause in the questions here in the chat. So.
Great. I have one more controversial question that I would love to cover, which is, so Mahimna, do you believe a system that enforces send order fairness is inherently fair?
In what, like in an ideal world that you could get some kind of send order fairness?
Yeah.
Yeah, if you have like enough geodistribution of the nodes, yeah.
Okay, I kind of don't think that's true.
Do you have any follow?
Yeah, so my follow-up is like, even if you have send order fairness, there's still like some game as to like who sends first and who gets the profits. And like,
let me clarify like what send order fairness is.
Yeah.
I don't know. So basically, we formalized this notion called send order fairness in like an ideal world where your transactions get ordered based on when you sent them at like at the point of origin rather than at the point of receive by the nodes. So in like an ideal world where you could actually order based on when the transaction was sent, then that's sort of the way to order transactions because there's sort of no manipulation involved from the nodes. And like the fairness properties that we try to define try to get close to this ideal world notion of send order. So yeah, go ahead.
No, I just open the floor to the room. I still think even in a send order fair system, right? Like it doesn't say anything about incentives to spam or like who gets arbitrage profits or, incentives to censor. I guess censorship is taken care of. Okay. Spam and like who gets the profits, right? And like what's the game there?
I mean, it's sort of like this ideal world definition, right? Where you're just like sending the transaction. So whenever you like send the transaction, it gets like magically recorded. And there's sort of a global time, right? Because sending time is like one fixed time rather than receive at the different nodes and different amounts of latency.
Yeah, so I still think even if you had that, you would still have a pretty robust ARB game that you would still need to democratize the profits of somehow.
The ARB game there, like there's no difference in like what the nodes see the ordering as, right? Because let's say it's like hypothetically timestamped at the sender, so all the nodes have like the same view now.
In your like idealized world, yeah, but like not in real life, right? Like what if one node is MetaMask and it's like gets a lot of transaction flow, then it has some vantage point the other nodes don't have, or like yeah, what if
like an ideal world, right, where it's just like the nodes don't matter anymore because everything's just timestamped at the clients and like the nodes actually don't matter in the consensus.
So let's say not in the ideal world, but in the real world, if we had a send.
In the real world, it just doesn't work because you bring in like network latency, right? But in like that's why in like the ideal world we want to be as close to that as possible. But do you at least buy the argument that in an ideal world that's sort of the notion that we would want to go with?
Well, I think it's a useful primitive. I don't know if it solves the problem. That's what I feel.
Okay. Even in an ideal world?
Even in an ideal world, unless you assume it solves the problem, but then you're like circularly solving it.
I think Kushal has a good point here in the chat, which is he's saying that doesn't send order fairness make power dynamics favorable for entrenched people who can fire faster? Just the barriers to entry to the MEV game get higher, in his opinion, in that case. Also, we have a question from Skyhard about asset prices? Like, does the price of Bitcoin affect the amount of MEV or like the quantity of people playing the search game, et cetera? Or like the security of the system?
I would say not directly. And I think this is, the last question we have time for because I have a hard stop. Thank you guys for these amazing questions. That was super fun. So my argument would be not directly. I think, for example, falling price also often creates a lot of MEV. So like if price moves quickly, you create a lot of ARB opportunities. You create people who have debt on the system who need to be repossessed. And you create just a lot of churn, high transaction fees, competition for space. All of these things in a falling price market create MEV. Same in like a market that's rising very quickly, same reasons for creating MEV. So I think price moves are more substantial, but I also think there's a correlation between how many people use the system and MEV. So like more users, you have more transactions to reorder and more money to extract. And in some ways, if you're measuring the MEV in US dollar amounts, then there's also a direct effect of like, if you extract 2 ETH, how much MEV is that? Is it 5,000 or $50 million? It makes a difference. So I think there's like a lot of indirect reasons that adoption and price like push up on MEV, but it's not direct.
Okay. It's, I don't know what time it is on the East Coast, but it's 11 a.m. here. So our session is over.